All right. So I'm here with Shara McCallum, poet extraordinaire. And Shara, you have a poem for us, No Ruined Stone, that I would love to hear. And then we can get into our conversation.
Thank you, Shanta, for having me on the anthology. It's not really a program, but it's an interesting project. So this is No Ruined Stone. There are two actually poems that bear that title from my most recent book called No Ruined Stone. And the first and the last poem bear the title. This is the second of the two and the last in the book. So I'll read it, and then when we chat about it, I'm sure things will come to light. No Ruined Stone. When the dead return, they will come to you in dream, and in waking will be the bird knocking against glass, seeking a way in, will masquerade as the wind, its voice made audible by the tongues of leaves, greedily lapping as the waves' self-made fugue is a turning and returning. The dead will not then, nor ever again, desert you. Their unrest will be the coat cloaking you. The farther you journey from them, the more distance will maw in you. Time and place gulching when the dead return to demand accounting, wanting and wanting and wanting everything you have to give, and nothing will quench or unhunger them as they take all you make as offering, then tell you to begin again.
Damn. So tell us a bit about this page. I know you said a couple of choices, but this was one of your choices for reading. And why did you choose it? And how does it represent your practice?
So I've always been a poet who's interested in speaking to the dead and for the dead. And this book is no exception, that this is the final poem. It's also a book entirely almost of voices that are not my own. So I work a lot with dramatic monologues, what in the contemporary vernacular we call persona poems, where the poet is adopting a character and speaking in first person, but as someone else. The majority of this book, that's what's going on. So the fact that I don't leave it there, but I come back in as Shara at the end, the poet, to me is quite significant in terms of your interest in voice, because now it's a layering of voices. And so some of the voices of the dead that populate this book are enslaved people, mixed race, descendants of enslaved African women in particular, and also the descendants of the Scottish masters. That's who's most recently spoken before I speak. Obviously, that bears a striking resemblance to my own backstory. But as I say to people, when I read the poems that are actually in the voice of the second part of the book is voiced by a woman named Isabella, I wasn't born in 1806 into slavery. The fact that I can pass for white is entirely different than being forced to pass for white to survive slavery, which is Isabella's story. So I think that that's what's interesting to me about voice always as a poet, especially interested in dramatic monologues. There's my voice, right? Or some part of Shara that is in the poem always. But I'm very interested in the layering of those other voices. And this poem addresses that. You know, when the dead return, what are they here for? What are they asking of me as the poet and as the human to carry their voices and their histories? What does that feel like? And what do I do with that? So I think I'll say that much to start, Shanta.
I'm very curious, actually. I'm going to divert from the questions because you said you are doing or engaging with dramatic monologue or the persona.
Yeah.
And I would, maybe you might disagree. I would say I mean, as a fellow poet, I feel like a lot of it is
Yeah.
persona on the page, right? Where you're just like, I was just a
Mhm.
conduit. Can you talk to me about that channeling? Where like
Sure.
how does that work for you? And then how do you necessarily care or feel like you have to like sometimes separate from those voices and your voice, especially in that flow? I want to hear more about that.
Sure. So I agree with you. Sometimes we use the word persona, and it's, it's an ancient term. It has a psychological and philosophical dimension connected to the various selves that we are. So, of course, even the first person lyric poem, not a dramatic monologue, is a constructed I that is on the page. It is not mimetic to all parts of who Shara is, even if it bears an autobiographical trace of who I am. I also, I love to say this to people, I also do grocery shopping. And that Shara doesn't show up in these poems ever, right? So we have many personae, and we sing, sometimes we make one of them more distilled in order to create voice on the page. Yeah, some thread of who we are. We might call that tone. But for me, it's always being created anyway by diction, which is the principal driver of character and voice, and the color of a voice, the tone, the attitude of the speaker. All of that is going to come through diction. Yeah. So yes, I agree with you that we're always using voice and persona as poets, no matter what the mode. But the dramatic monologue is a hyper attenuated form of a speech act. If the lyric poem to me is a very private speech act, often poet speaking to herself, the dramatic monologue has a stage on which the poet is standing. And I think about those as very different kinds of voice. The one that often has a direct address, even if it's implied or it's layered. For example, most dramatic monologues are, if I like to think of them as provoked speech acts. When do we in life monologue? Generally when someone has provoked us, right? So there's an urgency, and who are we speaking to, right? So that charge creates kind of intimacy in the voice that I think of as very different. The tools are the same, but the direction of voice is quite different to me. And I think this poem is an interesting example of almost coming out of dramatic monologues, because those are what you've just heard, right? But I am asserting this is the lyric I poet speaking again. So now it's layering those kinds of voices on top of each other. They don't have to remain discrete, but I always find it very useful to think about what the different modes of poetry give us in terms of voice. The narrative has a voice too. It's the voice of the storyteller, which is also a mode of poetry, long, but it's a different articulation of language toward a different end.
Do you define voice? And when you're composing your work, do you think about like how it feels on a page versus you engaging it as provoked speech on a stage? Is that in your mind? Like, talk to me a bit about those things.
Sure. I think when I begin, I usually hear a voice. So the voice of poetry to me is a string of language that I identify in my mind's ear as sounding like a poem. And then I follow that to see where it leads. And out of that, I will construct a voice. But initially, what I'm just interested in is the sound of someone speaking to me in my mind. And, or sometimes a string of language that's highly musical and highly imagistic. That will sound like a line of poetry to me, the voice of poetry now, right? As opposed to my everyday mundane voice. Some people like to play with speech that is quotidian, and that's voice to them. So I'm not trying to shut down all those other categories. I'm really speaking very specifically. Even when I bring in voice that is demotic, so sometimes I write in Creole, Jamaican patois, right? I notice the same characteristics are there. It's usually highly musically charged, highly imagistic, or it sounds like a person in crisis or in some moment of situation that they would be forcing them to speak. That's how I tend to write. I often ask myself questions like, who is she? Because it's mostly women. Where is she, this voice? Right? And by asking those questions, I'm building the voice. By making those decisions in revision, not in the first draft. The first draft, I just let it unfurl. But when I decide that I want to revise it, then I start to ask those questions. Who is this speaker? Where is she in time and place? What does she care about? And how will I bring that fullness? I like to think of it like I'm building a world in the poem to give her voice habitation. So with Isabella, the character from No Ruined Stone who precedes Shara speaking in that last monologue, Isabella is a voice and a character who I know would have existed, and yet she doesn't exist in the annals of history very much. And when she shows up in literature, I hate her. She's a tragic figure, right? The tragic mulatta who can belong to no world and therefore must kill herself, literally. And since I don't
are you talking about the same
yeah.
Isabella who was kept behind a wall in New York?
No,
okay.
I'm speaking very specifically about the Isabella that I constructed in this book.
In your book.
Right.
Yes.
So in my book, she is a mulatta and she's passing for white. And she is a figure that we all would recognize, right? So in my previous book, Madwoman, I have many vocalizations of the madwoman. I'm deeply interested in these kinds of tropes of history, these women that we see. And I find that their stories and the fullness of their voice is often absent in the literature. So I'm drawn to creating more habitation for that voice in my poems, right? A world. I built a whole book with a narrative action so Isabella could have a world to exist in, that voice that I heard by asking myself those questions.
I love that. And the reason why I asked that question, because there is a story about it, Isabella, that I did write about in one of my poems a while ago, where she was this figure hidden behind a wall. And this whole lore, it's such a crazy story coming from the West Indies. And the story about what happens when she emerges. And you are so right about what happens when we meet these voices and these figures in literature versus the agency, right, that they deserve. As we wrap, one last question I'm curious about. What haven't you done with voice on the page that you're interested in exploring in your work?
That's a really good question. I think I've tried to approach polyvocality, but the page is very limited. The page is ultimately bound by linear time, right? And so even if you can, and I've moved things across, I've used fragmentation, juxtaposition, all the tools of modernism and postmodernism that engage polyvocality. But at the end of the day, you can't simultaneously read, as opposed to when you listen to music, which is really where this idea comes from for me. And I've been obsessed with since the beginning is the idea of the fugue, which I just realized I mentioned a fugue.
Me too. Yes. Right? Yes. Oh, yes. God, I'm obsessed with it. Yes.
I think I will never be able to reproduce that as a poet, but I keep trying because while I love the singular I think all of us are comprised of all of those voices that we hear that are voices. For me, often they're ancestors, like known to me, you know, on this planet when they were alive, as well as those I never met, but whose stories I carry. So I like to think that I'm a combination of all of those, you know. I'm also the combination of all the poems I've ever read as a poet. So even the singular I that I think of as so distinctive, and I push back against that all the while. Obviously, my DNA as a poet is also comprised of every poem I've ever read and loved, right? So that voice is polyvocal, it's multiplicitous. And I'm always trying to get that in, you know, in a poem, but it's a hard thing because when I say poems are bound by linear time, I mean the reading of the poem. Whether I read it to you aloud, whether you read it yourself, even if you have it across the page and you say, okay, well, there's multiple readings I could engage here. I could do this, then this, then this. The fact is you have to start somewhere and move through time when you're hearing it, right? So either the top of the page to the bottom that's the time of the poem as something we hear, the voice of the poem that we hear. Whereas with music, you can have all of those at one time, playing at once.
That's so true. This is great. Thank you for your time. If you just stay on for a second after, I'm going to stop recording.